Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows. My name's Al Horner, and on this week's show, she brought a small town to its feet and a huge company to its knees. That's right, this week on the show, we're talking all things Erin Brockovich with the film's talented writer, Susannah Grant. Susannah is a talent who, over an impressive 3-decade career, has gone from writing on the 90s TV teen drama Party of Five, to conquering animation with Pocahontas, to penning dramas like 28 Days, rom-coms like In Her Shoes, and science fiction with The Fifth Wave. She's also a force to be reckoned with behind the camera. You might have seen her directorial debut, the comedy drama Catch and Release, which came out in 2006. More recently, you may have seen episodes of her searing Netflix series Unbelievable, which took a scalpel to the problem of rape culture in America. Erin Brockovich, though, remains one of her best-loved works, and understandably so. Her witty script for this Julia Roberts starring, Steven Soderbergh-directed legal drama earned her an Oscar nomination on release in 2000, and it's both a testament to her writing and an indictment of our society's lack of progress that the film still feels so relevant today. The movie told the true-life tale of a single mother who fought and won a landmark legal case against the Pacific Gas and Electric Company over contaminated water supplied to residents in the town of Hinkley, California. In order to secure justice for the hundreds of people made sick by PG&E's malfeasance, the real-life Erin had to navigate misogyny, classism, and the demands of parenthood. Susannah's script captured all of that with poignancy and punch. In the spoiler conversation that you're about to hear, Susannah tells me about the importance of David versus Goliath stories like this. We discuss her memories of getting burgers with the real-life Erin Brockovich, the balance of fact versus fiction in the movie, and the one single line from her draft that the real-life Erin requested be changed. It's a fascinating conversation. A huge thank you to Susannah for her time and her insights, and a huge thank you also to our Patreon community, without whom this show would not be possible. If you like what we do and want to help this show continue to grow, you can join that Patreon community by visiting patreon.com/scriptapart, where for the price of a single monthly cup of coffee, you'll get ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, and access to our brand new video segment, Postscript, which we drop every week after an episode airs. That address again, in case you'd like to get involved, it's patreon.com/scriptapart. Okay, that's all the admin out of the way. Let's get into it, shall we? This is the incredible Susannah Grant discussing the first draft secrets of Erin Brockovich. Thanks so much for tuning in. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demek. Hey Susannah, such a delight to have you with us. How are you doing today?
I'm great, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I should confess from the start, I always want interviews to go well, but I do feel an increased pressure speaking with you because you clearly are capable of the most devastating put-downs. I'm thinking specifically of the line in Erin Brockovich, "That's all you got, lady. 2 wrong feet and fucking ugly shoes." That is one of the most brilliantly brutal insults in cinema history for my money. And I don't want to be on the receiving end of a burn like that if you don't like my questions today.
No, well, like most people, I reserve that sort of unfiltered interaction for my work. I tend not to be that unkind in person. I think it all the time, but it doesn't come out of my mouth as frequently as it does in the characters I write.
Okay. My beat up Reebok trainers can breathe a sigh of relief. Susannah, I'm overjoyed to have you on the show because not only does your work have, fantastically memorable dialogue and one-liners like that one, they also often center these incredibly smart, capable women fighting for their independence in male-dominated worlds. These women are also kind of crucially often allowed to be flawed. They're not superhero girl bosses. These women feel real. And the stories that you tell are sometimes kind of lightning rods for these bigger societal debates, or at least those are the threads that I've always seen as existing between a lot of your work. Is that anywhere close to how you define your writing style and the shared DNA between all these different projects that you've worked on over the years? Like, how do you sum up the types of stories you like to tell and how you tend to tell them?
Well, there's a couple things. I often hear that I write strong women, and that always it sort of tweaks me a little bit because they're not always that strong. They're sort of equally strong and weak, and equally flawed and uh, gifted. But what I hope that I do, and what I hope people are actually saying, is that I write women who feel authentic.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a rarity enough that it gets translated as strong. I think strength culturally is a little overvalued. I think vulnerabilities are often as important and certainly as interesting dramatically as the places where we're strong. So anyway, that just touches on that first comment you made. And as to the sort of larger societal things, it takes a long time to write a script. And for me, I end up thinking about it all the time in a kind of wonderful way. I sometimes wonder what people who aren't writing are thinking about when they're doing their shopping or their gardening or going to sleep at night, because it is the wonderful question and problem I'm always tossing around in my mind. So if that's going to be the case, I certainly want it to be about something bigger than, the particulars of the story that I'm writing. Sort of, if you're not writing about some bigger ideas, I can't imagine where I would get the stamina to get through the end of something. But that's just me, and I also feel like it's a bit of a cheeky thing to say, oh, here are my ideas. I'm gonna throw them out into the world and foist them on people. And I do think there's a bit of an obligation to think about them a little deeply and find some resonance that goes beyond the details of the story, to earn your place, to earn your time, to hope that it will resonate with other people, which you need it to do to get made.
Well, that's really interesting, and it leads us really nicely into the film we're going to talk about today. We're speaking today about Erin Brockovich because, well, not only is this a wonderful movie, but also to kind of speak to that point of like the wider societal themes. Like, our news cycle in 2023 is still so full of stories about corporations prioritizing their bottom lines over the health of the customers that they supposedly serve. And, the film remains, decades on, such a great blueprint for standing up against that kind of exploitation, like a reminder that it's possible for David to beat Goliath. Mm-hmm. When you wrote it, were you seeing it through that lens? Did you have a sense that there was something bigger that Erin's story could speak to in terms of American capitalism, American misogyny, that audiences would latch onto for decades to come?
I just automatically say no instinctively, that I didn't think, oh, great, I can go at capitalism, or great, I can go at misogyny, because I think, if, at least for me, if I come at a project with the theme first, or the an agenda like that, I don't think the work is as interesting as if I come at it from a character, always from a character. Obviously, you need story, that's essential. But I had just finished doing a film called Ever After, which is a Cinderella movie, and the language in it is fairly contained and controlled, and I'm not all of it, but the general language in it was had a lot of structure to it, and I had just kicking in my head, I thought, I just need to write a kick-ass broad. I don't know what that is, but I know that is what I just want the language to be looser. I want everything to be freer and janglier. And as I was sort of thinking that, I heard about Jersey Films had optioned the rights to Erin's story. And I was fairly new in my career and not the obvious choice. So I had to sort of persist with them. But there was certainly her the way she greeted the world felt like exactly what I wanted to dive into. It's not dissimilar to how I do. She's a little bit more out there than I am, but I just felt drawn to her. I'm always interested in people who are underestimated, either by others or by themselves, and I'm always interested in when somebody has to prove him or herself bigger than they thought they were. That's always interesting to me. Sure, there are psychological reasons for that, but and then the fact that the story had implications beyond her was wonderful. It was really attractive to me. But what I was initially drawn to was her character, the fact that she had qualities that for most of her life had done nothing but trip her up and block paths and screw her over and make life difficult for her. She'd had marriages fall apart. She'd had jobs fall apart because of these qualities she had, of relentlessness, of inability to drop something, inability to not engage an argument when she sees it. That had not worked well for her in life. And then by fate or, by some sort of divine intervention, she found herself in a situation where those qualities were exactly what were needed for success. And sometimes I think that's the key, to finding your value in life, to finding the place where your broken bits fit perfectly in the situation. And then, it's making, look, had there not been a story with larger implications, with environmental implications, with corporate implications, with a story that put it on a larger canvas, I'm not sure I would have been as drawn to it. But I'm always interested in character first. I tend to write from a very characterological perspective. Outlining comes less naturally, plotting comes less naturally than character. And I usually let character drive the story. I think it works better.
That makes a lot of sense. You can definitely tell in the projects you work on. What overlaps, Susannah, did you have with Erin, if any, as, a young female storyteller making her way through the world? There's so much resistance that Erin faces in the film because of her gender and her perceived class. You were, as you say, relatively new to the business, and a business, we should mention, that still struggles to take female artists seriously today. So God knows what it was like back then. Were there elements of Erin's story and the kind of microaggressions that she faced every day that you were able to kind of tap into and were able to kind of pour into the script?
I honestly think our connection has more to do. She needed to approve me as the writer. So we met and immediately felt kindred spirits. And I think that connection probably has more to do with our families of origin and birth order and, how we see the world. We both will clock every slight when it's happening and catalog them and, build a really long and entertaining list of ways in which people have fucked us over. And, we can both go deep on that. And I think another thing I share with her and was something that was essential to her success in the circumstances of the story was the thing I found most beautiful about her is that she genuinely believes that every human being has a right for his or her story to be heard and believed, and she doesn't care about, she really couldn't care, not only doesn't care about status, doesn't see it. And, and I don't know, I think I share that. I hope I share that with her. I mean, we just saw the world the same way. And I think that was more relevant to our connection and to my ability to feel her essence and then translate that into a script than any particulars of, the businesses where we were. I mean, those are the things that probably put us where we were, in places where we were ready to, take a big swing and knock down a wall or two, you know?
I think one major contributor to how dramatically rich this movie is how, as we kind of touched upon at the beginning, Erin is allowed to be kind of messy. She's imperfect, and the movie doesn't shy away from that or apologize for it or kind of, veer towards a more saint-like depiction of her as she seamlessly deals with all the problems. Like, she strains and she struggles. There is a cost that comes with her obsession with fighting this case. And we feel it in the movie. She has this beautiful family at home, these kids, she has this partner, and she's just not able to be as present for them as perhaps she'd like, the more and more she kind of tumbles down the rabbit hole of this fight against PG&E. That's all quite vulnerable stuff. Did the real life Erin need any coercing at all into showing that more vulnerable side of her private life?
She needed no coercing. She has no ego. She's very comfortable with her, her weak spots, her soft spots, her brittle parts. She just was happy for the story to be told, and really didn't think anybody would pay it any attention, but one thing I'm very sensitive to in stories where women are doing impressive things or time-consuming things professionally is that there is a trope within at least American filmmaking. I don't know if the same is true in the UK or in Europe, of that automatically meaning that the home suffers.
Yeah.
And I find it dull and diminishing, and you never ever see a film where a man is crushing it at work and he's neglecting his family. You occasionally see it, but rarely. It's not a trope. So it was important to me. You list those moments where her failings are identified once. Failings is the wrong word. The cost of her work.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to clock that the movie opens with that. Before she even has this job, before she even is taking this on, she sits on a stand in her, trial and clocks, failed marriages, spotty professional career. This is not someone. So when it comes up later that there are things that she is falling short of in her own estimation, it's not the first time. It's not just because she's working. You know what I mean? And that felt important to me, to establish her vulnerabilities early and not have her be totally together. And then she takes on something great and then the home life suffers. That makes me crazy.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. That strand of your work, though, the kind of authenticity, the messiness, the just the realness of the characters you tend to write, it sounds like it stemmed from a really early trip to the cinema, age 13, to see Network. You've described in the past, I love that film. You've described in the past how everyone in that movie has the most powerful engine working constructively and destructively within them, which is something I think is true of Erin too.
Yeah. That movie just blew my mind. It was rated R, I think, and I lived in New Jersey in the 70s, and they'll let a 9-year-old into an R movie at that point. There were no laws in New Jersey in the 70s. Here, have a beer, kid. But yeah, watching those characters fire off so powerfully in both constructive and destructive directions, and the battle within it. There's that scene with Faye Dunaway having sex with William Holden, and she's just rattling off all her work stuff while she's having this completely impersonal affair. I just thought, whatever is going on within that person feels like real life to me. And if you can capture that and show that to other people, they'll feel seen. I felt, obviously, I was 12 or 13. I'd never done anything like that. But the mess of their insides being visible like that made me feel like the mess of my insides had a place in the world. And I thought, wow, if I can be a part of that storytelling tradition where the stories you tell make people feel a bit more seen and a bit less alone, that would be a nice life. I could feel okay about that life.
Well, yeah, it is something that, is evident in Catch and Release and Unbelievable, certainly, which you've described in the past how, as a writer, I think this was in reference to Unbelievable, when you're adapting a true life tale, you're going for the authenticity of someone's experience. So you were making the distinction that, sometimes you kind of have to invent moments that speak to the truth of that subject's experience, if not the objective reality of what happened to them. So to bring it back to Erin, what was your process of working with Erin to find out exactly what happened and then deciding where to stick to the facts and where to maybe take some creative license? Because there are a few scenes I understand that they didn't exactly happen, but they speak to the truth of what she was feeling.
Yeah, well, that is the question, fact versus truth. Because I mean, the most obvious example is the what she missed out in her life with her children while she was doing all this work, this 2-year period of her life where she's got 3 kids at home and is not able to connect with them. And she missed birthday parties, she missed parent nights, she missed all kinds of things. And that was important to show. I realize I just want to be careful that I don't negate what I said earlier. It was important to show, but you can't just, I honestly remember that as I started writing that, I thought, is this a montage? Well, anytime you're asking yourself, is this a montage? The answer is no. Virtually anytime there is a better way of doing it. And what I ended up coming up with at the time, actually, I was driving home late a lot because as I started the script, I was also working on a television show. And my boyfriend at the time, now my husband, I'd get on the freeway and I'd call him and I'd say, I'm tired, talk to me while I drive home. And so what I ended up writing was that scene where she calls George and says, I'm tired, about to run off the road, keep me awake. And he tells her that she's missed her daughter's first word. And it's so beautifully directed by Steven Soderbergh and performed by Julia and Aaron Eckhart. He just lets it linger. Soderbergh lets that scene linger so long as it hits her what she's missed. And it's a short scene. I think it's maybe 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. And it's so powerful, I think, so much more powerful than relating the facts of those 2 years. And for me, I think about it a lot when I'm writing other scripts. It's just like, sometimes you do something and this film was relatively early in my career, so there were a lot of lessons and notes to self from it. And that's one, finding the one powerful moment to make the point that you're trying to make, as opposed to making it in quiet half measures along the way,
And was there also an obstacle to be overcome in how to write dialogue for Erin? Because, I can imagine once you've struck up a friendship with someone who you deeply admire, I can imagine it being kind of daunting then having to kind of put words into their mouth, if you like. Did you end up having to kind of separate the two people in your head, like the real Erin and the fictional one, in order to be able to kind of move forward with the script and not feel like you were beating yourself up all the time, trying to replicate exactly what the real Erin would say in any given situation?
Yes, absolutely. I spent a lot of time with her. She drives a ton. And so I just hopped in her car with her and hit play on my tape recorder. And so then I would come home and I would transcribe our conversation. So her voice really seeped into my mind and my brain. But then when I sat down to write, I did have this moment of like, I'm not sure what she would say then. Maybe I should call Erin and ask her. I'm not sure what she would drink then. Does she like Coke or Pepsi? I should call Erin and ask her, And it was about half a day of that, of really feeling as if I were trying to write in handcuffs or sitting on my hands, that I hadn't given myself the authority I needed to feel loose and free. And so I just decided, trust that you will honor the truth of who she is, and that it's there in your mind and in your heart, and just write it, and write your Erin. And at the end, when you get to the end, if it doesn't look and feel like her, you can adjust. But I couldn't write anything if I didn't feel like I was the authority on it. If I thought she was the authority on it, I can't imagine how I would have gotten past page one,
Yeah.
And it hung me up for maybe about a day.
Well, it sounds like as it happens, Erin, the real Erin, was overjoyed with what you created, and she described the film, I think, as 90% accurate. And it sounds like the only detail.
Oh, I thought she said 98.
Oh, maybe that's
maybe
I've
given myself great inflation over the years.
No, I think it's more that I can't read my handwriting here. Am I right in thinking though that the only detail that she did request be changed from your first draft was a line in which a character claimed, "I can see your panties," to which Erin replied, "You're a liar. I'm not wearing panties."
Yes, she left. I sent her the script, and then I had sort of a shallow breathing 48 hours while she read it, where I thought, oh my God, I've never been more nervous to have somebody read my work than that draft. And she called and I wasn't there. And so she left a message, and her only message was, "Girl, I always wear panties." Other than that, it's great. Script that line didn't make its way into the movie, but yeah,
that's crazy.
That was her one objection.
Well, speaking of first drafts, you've described having a tendency to overwrite. That your first drafts are often 145 pages or so, making the rewrite process one in which you're kind of looking for the things you can scale back. Yeah. How did that translate to your first draft of Erin Brockovich? How different was that first draft?
167 pages.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. I'm a little better at it now. I can pull stuff out as I go, but then I think a lot about the Michelangelo sculptures, his slaves. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they're and you can see, they're emerging from the marble. And I think about that process of sort of you throw a big chunk of matter out there, and then you sort of chip away and chip away and chip away, and the sharper image of what you're trying to say emerges. For me, there are some people who write 100 or write like 85-page first drafts and then have to beef it up and have to find out where to expand it. That's not me. I really the other analogy that comes to me when I work sometimes is scrambled eggs. You know how when you throw it in the pan, it's just runny and swimmy all over, and then you just have a low flame under it and stir it and stir it and stir it, and gradually it sort of takes shape, it pulls itself together, and eventually it's got the form you want it to have. But it's a lot of time of feeling it and pulling something out. No, it was better, put it back in, pull something else out. It's a bit of a dance with it, which I quite like. For some reason I feel like I and still to this day, and maybe it's maybe it has to do, I acted a little bit before I wrote, and it could have to do with that, but I often find myself, at least in the first third of a script, writing someone's entire day, when really all you want is one moment of that day. But I think that's sort of the process of finding them. And I'm also always interested in finding the unexpected moment, and if I don't write through too much, sometimes I won't find the unexpected moment. I have a little agreement with myself that I don't consider a scene. I don't move off from a scene until something I've written within it has surprised me. Until there's something in there that I didn't know I would find going in. If I have an outline card and it says, Bill goes to the store, buys coffee, and I just write that, and there isn't something in it that's got a little ring of truth that I hadn't anticipated going in. That's a bad example, because sometimes you just do need a guy going in and buying coffee. So that's not the one. But with scenes of conflict or seduction or negotiation, or I always try to find something I hadn't expected.
Well, I really identify with the scrambled egg analogy, although in my version of that, I put on the flame too high, the fire alarm's going off, smoke everywhere.
Well, that can lead to some good stuff too,
Yeah, sure. Once the fire brigade have gone home. So what was left to scale back then? Were these extra scenes that kind of amounted to those 160 plus pages, or were the existing scenes just running long?
I think there were more. The plaintiffs were a bit longer. There's probably a lot of shoe leather that isn't there. It's really hard to remember because it wasn't any story elements at all. There was something we added. She got quite sick and ended up in the hospital at one point, and I was encouraged to put that bit in. That got added in like the second draft, and may in fact have been shot, but didn't end up in the final film. There is a moment where she's quite ill toward the end, but having her go into the hospital just kind of slog the story down. So that's the only story thing I can think that was put into the script. That's not in the first draft, though. No, it really is just kind of flabbier ways of telling the story than I end up with. It's like the beginning of the scrambled eggs as opposed to the end.
One thing that is different from your script to the finished movie is the introduction. Your script begins with the following. So we start on a sidewalk, palms sway, the sun washes everything in yellow, cars motor down either side of the landscaped median. The calls of mockingbirds mingle with the blip blip of car alarms. Then, in the middle of this pedestrian normalcy, a pair of impossibly high, spike-heeled pumps struts out of a shop. So high, it hurts to look at them. As the shoes leave frame, we tilt up and see they're leaving a 99-cent store. As the pumps turn and head up the street, we see they are connected to a pair of impossibly long, shapely legs. Ever-ready legs, they just keep going and going. They saunter past two businessmen on a lunch break. The men pause and glance as men tend to do when they see a beautiful woman. In fact, everyone this woman passes lets their eyes rest on her a microsecond longer than usual. You go on to describe how eye-catching is an understatement. All these folks who say Barbie's proportions are unrealistic have never met Erin Brockovich before. It feels like you immediately wanted the film to begin by viewing Erin through the way people, and specifically men, view her, the male gaze. And then the film, of course, goes on to really wonderfully upturn, that gaze. Can you talk to me what the sort of idea was of that beginning and how it evolved? Because it seems like Stephen added an extra scene.
Yeah. Well, I go back to the idea of underestimating or misestimating someone. And that's something Erin herself, I think she just loves playing with it. I think she loves setting people up. I mean, she honestly, as she says in the film, she says, I like the way I dress. She loves the way she dresses. She dresses like that. I would not have made a point of it had it not been a really a key element of how she engages with the world. Like, go ahead, think you know me, so that was important, and it is both, you know, it works for her at times, more often it works against her, but yes, to then upend the expectations that people bring to her based on how she looks, I think it is, I mean, I think it was fun for her, honestly. She got a kick out of it. And then, yes, that's not how the film ultimately starts. And I think Stephen, I mean, here you have a great big movie star. Why not give her an up close up and show a little bit more of how her professional history has played out, because that doesn't come out as much in the courtroom scene,
Yeah.
which gives you a lot of her personal history, but to see that the professional history and the way that the world has not risen to meet her felt important right at the beginning there.
By the time you get to the finished film, the courtroom scene and the scene that Stephen adds, where she's in a job interview, explaining who she is, how she has kids, and how life got in the way of all these aspirations, the two work in tandem to really organically deliver exposition. Like by the time you've got through those first couple of scenes, you know exactly who she is, you know exactly who she wanted to be, but who maybe she wasn't able to be. And yeah, we also, I mean, the job interview, we see this male interviewer kind of turn his nose up at her, and that establishes a theme that's going to run through the film. Like it's as you say, it's a story about someone who's underestimated time and time again. So yeah, were you happy in that regard with the sort of the builds on your existing script that Stephen added? It seems like there's a really nice dialogue going on between your vision for the film and the things that he wanted to sort of sprinkle on top.
Yeah, that was added, and then the other element, that the a couple of scenes of Cherry Jones's character were added. Trying to remember that character's name. But it is pretty close to the first draft, certainly in shape, and a lot of the dialogue to that draft. But yeah, I mean, I'm thrilled with the film. I have no quibbles with it.
Can you tell me how you managed to introduce the PG&E component of the movie? Because, well, there's a phrase that I think it was coined by the Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil, and that phrase speaks to how evildoers kind of get away with doing bad things by making it just so bland and bureaucratic and kind of difficult to wrap your head around. What PG&E were doing and why it was exploitative is quite, it's potentially quite a banal thing to have to communicate to the audience. It's a lot of scientific names of chemical compounds and things like that. How did you go about like making it all digestible, making it all engaging?
Well, there are two things I'd mention about that. One was that it was important to me at the outset that we not actually have a person stand for our villain. There was like, well, where's the antagonist? Where's the antagonist? And it was very important to me that the antagonist be invisible. You never see the board, you never see the CEO, there's no person at the head of this who becomes your villain. There's no CEO saying, God damn that Erin Brockovich, you know what I mean? And that was important to me because what was happening to this community was so invisible, and their recourse felt so impossible. There was nobody even to talk to. The people delivering you the water were not the people in charge. The people you never got to talk to whoever was in charge. And that was part of the problem, so that was important. Not ever seeing your villain, which I had to defend a bit, but obviously worked out. And then secondarily, a lot of, getting all that information in there, and you have to tell the story truthfully, and you have to tell how complicated it was, and all the different storage tanks, and what the chemical does to the body, and the mislabeling of the chemical. They thought it was one chemical, it was other. There's a lot of technical jargon, and I just knew you would never follow the technical jargon if you weren't invested in the emotional journey of the characters in that scene while it's coming out. While you're being told the information, there's something interesting happening emotionally as well. There's a late night scene with Erin explaining everything to Ed in their office late at night, and they have pizza boxes, and it's kind of like their first, this is going to sound really minimizing of it, but it's kind of like their first slumber party as best friends. You feel them bonding over this shared endeavor, and that holds you in the scene because there's something kind of magical happening between these two people, and it's unexpected, and so you'll go along with everything they're saying because it's the glue of their bond. Not that we're not interested in the hexavalent chromium at that point, we are, but I think what holds you to that scene is that you're seeing two people see each other more clearly and more deeply and value each other more in the process of it. So, I mean, you can look through all the scenes where that kind of information is being given, and I think you'll find that they all have some emotional transitional quality to them that holds you closer to them.
It feels like, the victims, that was a route into making all the scientific jargon kind of matter. Like, you have to see the impact and the real life people. Were the kind of victims, were they fabrications, or were they all based on real life people? How did you kind of navigate that?
It was actually kind of interesting. As part of their settlement with PG&E, they all had, gag orders. They couldn't speak to anyone about the case or their settlement. So I could meet them, and I did meet a number of them, and we would talk about the weather and their garden and the news of the day, but we could not talk about the case at all. But I wanted to meet them, I wanted to know who they were if I was going to be, and I was also, I think I couldn't use their names, but I wanted to use authentic composites of them. But Erin, before the resolution of the case, had videotaped every interview she took with these people. So I would go to their houses and we would meet and we'd chat about everything else. And then I'd go home and pop a tape in the machine and watch Erin talking to them about the specifics of their case and how it had affected their families and their health and what losses they'd have. So I had kind of a two-pronged, God bless her for doing that. I think it made all the difference in the world. But they're all composites, but they're authentic composites. And there's no disease or physical effects of the poisoning invented. They're all authentic. Everything that's mentioned, people did actually suffer from.
On page 18, you introduce George, and you introduce him as someone who's tough. His denim, his leather, his bike, his long hair, everything but his eyes, which twinkle like Santa's. George is such an interesting character in this story, and he's one that, when we talk about sort of that fine line between, the kind of verging into that trope where sort of female characters are punished for embarking upon a professional quest, he seems to be quite an important cog in making it, sort of steering it away from being tropey. I love his character. I love how Erin plays him. Can you tell me a bit about like who he was to you and what the important things were kind of guiding, replicating him on the page and bringing him to life on the screen?
George and Erin were together when I first met her, which was well after the fact. I don't think they were still together when the film came out. I'm not sure about that. They had gotten together and broken up. They had had a volatile relationship, and they'd had maybe 4 breakups over the course of the film. Again, like the stuff with their kids, watching this couple break up and get back together 4 times was not going to work for the movie. But representing why the relationship suffered was important. Now, there were other factors that had to do with their own psychological makeup, who he was. And Erin was the one who had said, hey, I'm an open book. say what you want about me, let's tell this story, I don't care. George A had not made that bargain. I mean, we did get his rights and everything, but there was something different about it. It wasn't his story. So it didn't feel right to really, dig deep into whatever was driving. I think he's a complex character. I think I created someone who's interesting and holds and has something valid to say and has an interesting place in the world, but he's less close to the real George than Erin is to the real Erin. Their essential fight at the end, in which they split up, is very representative of a lot of their arguments. So I was truthful there, but I guess I would say I took a bit more license with him, both in service of the story and out of respect for the fact that, this wasn't his story. So there's no reason for me to expose things that would make him uncomfortable if they were, aired in the great wide world.
There's a beautiful moment where a sort of crowd of motorbikes go past and you just see his head turn and he follows them. And I think
there they go. Oh, there goes my life.
Yeah, there's so much that, like, those 2 seconds of film, imbue him with an interiority. Everything about like what he's being pulled away from by his love for Erin and his commitment to their family. It's really interesting sort of how he becomes like the person kind of holding down things, holding the fort down at home kind of thing. As we discussed, there is that scene in which like Erin misses her daughter's first word. It's really touching. There's also a scene in there that I think is so important, and it's kind of like a skeleton key for the rest of the film. Like, it's if you took it out, I don't know that the film would land the same way. There's a moment in which one of Erin's children picks up one of the documents that are just kind of strewn around the house, and he's reading about this kid made ill by PG&E's actions, and he says, that kid's the same age as me. And in that moment, like, we've seen Erin kind of follow this obsession of hers and just doggedly pursue it for, by this point, an hour. And in that scene, you completely understand why it hits home for her. And, well, the obsession seems justified if it wasn't already. Can you tell me about like that scene and why that was important to you to put in?
Yeah, that scene is really it's toward the end, actually, and it's when she's busting her ass to get all those signatures, and she and her son have had a really hard time, and he's acting out, and it's been really difficult with him. And after he says this kid is my age, he then says, why isn't his mom helping him? And Erin says, because his mom is sick too. And it's kind of the kid, it dawning on the kid that Erin might be doing something important, and it's sort of, and then he offers to get her breakfast, which he wouldn't have done prior to that. So I felt like it needed some sort of hint at healing with the kids, and the kids coming to understand that there was a bigger picture involved, which is hard for a kid to do. It's just a private moment with her and her boy toward the end.
Another element from this section of the movie that I find really intriguing is the introduction of this sense of a looming threat that is hanging over Erin and kind of closing in on her. We, of course, have that scene where, there's the phone call, her family's threatened. All of a sudden, Erin's having to contend with the very horrible realization that, her pursuit of justice could end up bringing physical harm to the people that she loves. And she has to weigh up a really important decision. Does she, how does she balance her impulse to protect her family against her impulse to do what's right for these people who've been, made victim of PG&E's malpractice? Amidst all this, the script then begins to thread in a mysterious character who, of course, will end up being a very important whistleblower who's key to victory in the entire case. Until we meet that character properly, though, and we learn who he is in that bar scene, and we understand what he's willing to divulge and how important that's going to be. Until then, the character is coded as, well, pretty sinister and quite menacing. Can you tell me about the reality of, Erin's situation as depicted in the movie, the degree to which, yes, she really was receiving horrible phone calls and seeing these kind of sinister, familiar faces watching her from afar? And yeah, how you wove it all together, because it comes together in the script in a really nice way.
That was completely true to her experience. And, the guy at the water board reporting her, and her figuring that out because she had signed her middle name, that was all true. The fact that the guy who gave her the documents, that was, I merged those. There were people watching her. There were people that made her very uneasy. The guy who gave her the documents was not one of them, but he was part of a sort of stew of people she had to win over. So putting them together didn't feel inauthentic, but it actually, in terms of the language of the movie and the rhythm of the movie, I think it really worked. I think that took two sort of disparate elements and combined them in the way that made the story have some cohesion, I want to go back to that scene about the kid, and this goes a little bit to process, and I can't remember if this is how it happened, but it's certainly how I work. What's likely is that script wasn't in there, that scene wasn't in there initially, and as I read through, I print out my work and I read it through every morning before I write, so that I have sort of a ramp up to it. It's possible that I read through it and thought, wait, there's a nagging question. What about the kids? What about her relationship with the kids? Did they find a healthier place than we left them in? And then the scene came out of that. I just, there are scenes within the script that do answer a question or provide that linchpin, and sometimes they're there when you write them out initially, but for me, quite often I'll read through and I'll think, oh, something's missing. Oh, I have a hunger to resolve something. There's a grace note missing of that thread, and sometimes the scene will come in that way instead.
Well, I'm glad we kind of actually went back to that scene with the kid, because that moment feels like the child understanding why it's important what his mother is doing. For George, he doesn't get that moment until the ending of the film, and it contributes to this incredibly sweet, like very moving ending where the victory that Erin achieves for these people, it's seen through the lens of the victims. We see how her fight has kind of directly benefited them, and George is along for the ride too. He's able to see how his sacrifice has helped, and it's made a tangible difference in the world. Can you talk to me about like constructing that ending? It's such a note perfect way to finish this story, and so emotive. Yeah, can you tell me about like how you landed on that, and whether there were different versions that you kind of explored before arriving at this one?
There probably were, but I can't remember any of them. I just knew that you had to honor the victim's experience completely before you could make it the emotional victory for Erin, because it wasn't about Erin. It wasn't about Erin. It was about these people. And so that scene with Mark Helgenberger is so important. If you hadn't had that, if you had just had the information that they'd won and then gone to that scene with Erin and Ed in their new fancy office, it would have been just wildly disrespectful of the people who had suffered. So that was really important. But at the same time, it's Erin's story, so give her victory. And the fact that he gave her that bonus and was
The callback to the beginning.
true. Yeah, he had done that as well, and her getting pissed off, prematurely pissed off about the amount and all that. It just it felt like there was room for that, having honored the experience. And you're right, having George there was important. Otherwise, you would have said, "What happened to George?" And he does. He sacrifices a lot, and it's important for him to see why.
Can you remember much about the first time you saw the film? Like it was emotional for me to watch from rewatch in preparation for this conversation. Can you remember the first time you watched the film and saw your script pretty much identically to how you had imagined it from what I've read up there on the big screen? Did you have an emotional response to it the way that I still do when I watch this movie?
The first time I saw it was at a test screening in Sacramento, I think. And it was very close to the finished script. There was a much longer sequence of getting the signatures that went on a long time. And but I mean, there were no reshoots or anything like that. It tested quite well. And it was probably early enough in my career that it didn't seem like a miracle, that the way I saw it in my head was how it ended up on the screen. Now I know what a miracle is. I was at the premiere, and Amy Pascal, who was running Sony at the time and had been a good friend to me, walked by me and pointed at me and said, "This never happens." And I remember thinking, yeah, sure it does. But no, it's one of the things I love about film is that you can never quite know if the alchemical reaction, the alchemical mix of the people and intentions and creative forces are going to pull it together in a way that you saw in your mind's eye. I had another film shooting at the same time as this, and I was on the set a lot of that film, and that doesn't look anything like what I saw in my head, the one I was on the set for. I was not on the set for Erin Brockovich, and it looks exactly like what I saw in my head. So
to go back to the word, I think you used the word miracle there, and how rare it is, certainly, that like something turns out as faithful to the kind of pure vision that you had at the kind of conception of the project. You've alluded to, over the course of the conversation, a few things you had to fight for to preserve. Like, were there kind of studio notes was there studio pressure to sand down the edges on this project much at all, that as you kind of alluded to, you did have to fight to protect?
Well, I do remember early on the concern about likability for her, which is, I think, for every single character I've written. Although I will say, for Unbelievable, Netflix didn't blink at all about those characters' likability. But that may be the only time in my career in which a sort of difficult woman is not worried about being likable. But I think that went away as soon as Julia Roberts signed on. That's a momentary concern, and that concern generally goes away after casting. Other than that, there was another film that was about a similar water poisoning. It was a Steve Zalian film called A Civil Action, and the scripts were out at the same time. And I do remember people saying, well, Zalian's film is out there and they've got Travolta, so I don't think this will ever get made. So, whatever. No disrespect to either Steve Zalian or John Travolta, of whom I am a huge fan, both of them. But the idea that there was only room for one environmental activist movie and it was the one with the guy, I objected to.
Oh gosh. Are you still in touch with Erin today, Susannah?
I haven't talked to her in a little while, but we did see each other a couple of years ago, and we did a Q&A together for the film, and then we went out and grabbed a bite after. And she's just such a fantastic woman. It took forever to leave the theater because she gives everyone her full attention, and not out of any like, oh, I need to give everyone much. She's genuinely interested in everyone she meets, everyone. And then we went out and, got added to a diner and got a burger. And by the time we finished our meal, she knew everything about the woman who brought us the food and like had solved a problem of hers. And she's just so beautifully connected to other human beings and sees their beauty and is the least judgmental person I've ever met, unless you fuck with her and then she will judge you to death, um I just love her. I haven't spoken to her in a couple of years, but I'm quite fond of her. And man, she's doing great work on. She tends to be a sort of gathering place for water concerns, and so she now has the Brockovich Report, which is a podcast, or not a podcast. It's a newsletter that goes out, and she will show up and lend her name and her efforts to a lot of water issues in the country. She's an unstoppable force. She's just wonderful.
The story about you guys going to grab a burger after the screening, that just makes me so happy because, well, I think it kind of like speaks to something that you forefront in the film really nicely that we haven't touched on, but I think is really important to discuss. It's not just the fact that she uncovers this, this cover up and this problem. It's her personal touch and her relatability that holds the whole case together and builds the trust that's requisite for these people to embark on this legal case with the firm. It would have been easy, in terms of kind of trimming this film down to kind of not really linger on that detail and the fact that really it's kind of Erin's ability to connect with other human beings, her interest in other people. Like it would have been easy to trim that, but I'm so glad it exists in the film, and I'm so glad that it has the kind of front and center spot that it does.
Yeah, there's a moment I'm quite fond of in the film that sort of highlights why she's able to do this and none of the lawyers are, and it's when when they offer bundt cake and Ed's like,
that's
out
right,
the door, and she says, have some fucking bundt cake, Ed. That it's like you cannot ignore the human of this. These are human beings, and if you don't show up as a human being, you're not going to get anywhere with them.
Yeah, if I ever serve someone some bundt cake, that is exactly how I'm delivering it. This is not a question related to the film, but it is something to do with your process and your kind of history as a writer that I find fascinating. You've described in the past kind of finding your voice through writing letters and then kind of taking that voice into your screenwriting. In fact, I think it's one of your main pieces of advice for young writers. Find your voice in a more free-flowing medium, free of the rigidity of a film script, which needs to have a certain architecture to it. Then kind of transpose it into screenwriting later on. I'm fascinated by that advice. Can you unpack the benefits of that for our listeners and how it's helped you?
Well, I just think the screenplay form, because of its rules and rules is the wrong word, but its structure is it's a difficult one to find your unique penguin song within. You know what I mean? That's it. I thought, as I said earlier, I thought I would be a part of this storytelling form initially as an actor, because that's what you watch. It feels like it's about the actors. And so I was in New York doing that and doing some freelance journalism stuff, and I missed my friends terribly, and I just wrote them letters and letters and letters, and I didn't even really realize that I had a writing voice. I mean, I'd written a lot in school, but they were relatively academic papers, and I didn't really realize that I had much of a voice until I read all these letters. For some reason, I would photocopy them before I sent them out. I don't know. I think I thought I was keeping a journal, kind of. And I can't imagine finding that in the structure of a screenplay for myself. I just think, there's so many freer forms of writing. And what you want to do is you want to tap into your unconscious place. Now the structure of screenplays is second nature to me. I don't think about it at all. You have programs that direct your cursor exactly where it needs to be, and I feel very fluid within it. And I feel like and I also am comfortable, writing 2 pages of dialogue if that's what I feel like doing in order to find the nugget that I'm looking for. I didn't mean 2 pages of dialogue. I meant like a 2-page monologue. I will, like, sometimes I'll just write and write and write and write for a character until I write my way to what I'm looking for. I think if you're not that fluid and familiar and literate in the screenplay format that comes with a couple decades of the job, it's just harder. It's just harder to feel free. There was a friend of mine talked about a creative writing class she took in college, in which the professor would come in and write 3 objects on the bulletin board, and maybe it was a button, I don't know what, the 3 little objects, and give people like 10 minutes to write a story about a character that had those 3 things in their pocket. Well, that's the kind of looseness you need to develop to find out who you are and what you think, and not what you think, and not who you want to be, but who you genuinely are and what you actually think. And that's what has to find its way into a script, I think, for it to have, for it to do what Network did to me. It has to be honest.
Well, I'm glad that we found our way back to Network, Susannah, because the way that film sounds like it was a really formative experience for you in shaping some of your storytelling sensibilities. When I think back on the movies that must have shaped mine, on the films that, well, certainly sparked at an early age my interest in storytelling, it's hard to discount those Disney Renaissance movies just because of the age I was at when those films were coming out. And you of course co-wrote one of those films. You co-wrote Pocahontas. Now, I've heard you discuss in the past some of your mixed emotions now when you kind of reflect back on that project. I understand that you kind of have a certain gratitude to, the lessons that it equipped you with in terms of your craft that you've been able to take forward into the rest of your career. But at the same time, you acknowledge that through the lens of our kind of modern values, there are aspects of that film that were kind of problematic, and representationally, it didn't get things right. I'd be curious to know, I was really interested to ask whether in this current era of live action remakes of Disney movies that we're in, whether you think a live action remake of Pocahontas could happen or indeed should happen, because it does feel like something that's, an any second now thing that could be announced on the company's current trajectory. Do you think it's possible to kind of do that, or do you think it's a story best left in 1995?
Yeah, I mean, I have so many, feel like I have to put so many asterisks next to that film. It was my first job I was offered, and they had just thrown out the script and they hired 3 new writers, the other 2, Philip Zabnik and Carl Binder, great friends. And we all did it together. And it didn't occur to me, and this just shows you, where I was at the time, and I say this with, no small amount of humility and embarrassment. But it didn't occur to me that I wasn't the person to tell that story, and they had a couple of Native American advisors, and so we're good, right? It is very much a Western take on it. I walked in, the real Pocahontas was 12 or 13, and I walked in the first day and I saw the body that she had designed. And obviously it's not 12 or 13-year-old. And I remember thinking, okay, well, if that's how she's built, one thing that's important to me, I had a friend of mine had 2, I did not have children at the time, but a friend of mine had 2 girls, and I thought they're going to see this film and they're going to see this woman built like this. And there are women who are built like that. But I said, it's really important to me that this body be of use to her before it be anything anyone else is looking at. So I feel like I'm trying to defend my work on this film, about which I have tremendous misgivings. But the fact that she starts out diving and canoeing and rafting and is strong and athletic came directly out of that, because I thought she cannot be shaped like this and only be an object of desire. That's insane. I loved movie music. I love musicals. I have always loved musicals. So the opportunity to work with Alan Menken and Stephen Schwartz was just unbelievable to me. And understanding how in a musical everything is in service of the songs was also really interesting. I don't think they'll make a live action movie of it. I don't think they should. I think it's a wildly problematic story in American history. Also, the rest of Pocahontas's life is quite tragic. And to tell, to mistell it the way we did. Look, it's got some great songs. You can tell I have a lot of misgivings about it. I understand why unemployed me took the job, and I learned so much on it. And I think there's a lot of really beautiful work in it by everyone. But it's a really problematic take on what is sort of one of the key cultural scars of our country, which is the genocide of the native population. So, it's I would argue strenuously against Disney remaking it or doing a live action version of it, unless they were going to really, really rethink the storytelling and have somebody other than, a waspy woman from Connecticut and a couple of white guys telling the story. There's my disclaimer on Pocahontas.
Yeah, I think that's really eloquently put. And I mean, for me, it's clearly a problematic tale. Like, I understand that now. A lot of those movies then, a lot of that era of Disney filmmaking had problems of representation. Aladdin, for example, had significant problems now when we kind of revisit that film. At the same time, though, I just feel like it would be dishonest for me to pretend that it didn't mean a huge amount to me at the time when I was a kid. And I still believe there's craft within that film that was magical. And, the storytelling, the songwriting. I guess these films just have to exist now with a bit of an asterisk by them.
Yes, well, absolutely, absolutely. There's beautiful work on every level in all those movies, but also in Pocahontas. And there's some gorgeous songs in it as well. Stephen Schwartz and Alan Menken wrote a beautiful score and soundtrack to it.
Well, I didn't want to let our conversation with you pass without flagging that, as is the case, I'm sure, for a lot of our listeners, I've been engaging with your work for a long time and still am today, of course. Your 2019 series, Unbelievable, was fantastic. If that's the work till now, Susannah, what can you tell me about the work still to come? Like, I'd love to wrap up this conversation by asking about, what's guiding you at the minute, I suppose, in terms of the projects that you're gravitating towards, and what the stories are that you'd love to tell going forward as you kind of move into this next chapter of your career.
I always try to make sure that that I'm guided more by my curiosity than the market. The market shifts, the market changes, and the market is always ready for something it didn't know it was ready for. So I'm lucky in that if I write something and I find it fascinating, but nobody else does, it's not going to set me back in life. It's okay. I can then go do something else. But really, does it interest me? Is it worth my spending 6 months of my life thinking about? Will it hold my attention for that long? I try to do work that I feel, I feel like it's going to sound, I don't know what it's going to sound like, but I do believe that every act we take, everything we do has either a teeny tiny constructive effect on the world or a teeny tiny destructive effect on the world. And I try to make sure that my actions and my work is on the former side of that and constructive. I don't have any interest in something that feels as if it's, dehumanizing or I don't have time for that, but I never really know what's going to interest me, what's going to excite me. Often I'm surprised by it. I certainly didn't think what I really want to do next is a limited series about a serial rapist in 2019. But there was this unbelievable article that was in ProPublica that just blew me away. And I thought this would really turn into something else entirely if we were able to do a limited series about it. And so we did,
Well, I encourage anyone who hasn't seen Unbelievable to stream it on Netflix now. Susannah, this has been such a beautiful conversation. Thank you so much for your time today. And thank you also for not insulting my shoes.
Oh, I'm sure they're dreadful.
They're quite bad.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
You've been listening to Script Apart. Thank you so much for tuning in. A reminder that if you want to help the show continue to grow, you can join us on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/scriptapart or clicking the link in today's show notes. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.